The most read book in history was written backwards. No one put down a single line about Jesus while he walked through Galilee. Not one disciple, not one hired scribe, not a single witness pulled out a pen while the man from Nazareth was still breathing, eating bread, sleeping in boats, and arguing with Pharisees face to face. For years, the only thing that existed of him were words spoken aloud. Air, memory, no ink at all. And yet, today you hold in your hands, or on your phone, a book of 27 works written about that man. The most copied text in all of human history, more than Homer, more than Plato, more than anything antiquity left us. So ask yourself the question almost no one asks. If at the beginning no one wrote anything down, where did the New Testament come from? Who really wrote it? In what actual order? And why did it take almost 3 centuries to become a single book? In the next few minutes, you're going to see how it was assembled from the inside, with no embellishment. The nervous letter that came before all the Gospels, the books that came within a hair of getting in and that no one knows today, the 3 sentences in your Bible that were probably added later, and the myth about who decided what got in that you've believed your whole life. Because here's the first thing that's going to surprise you, and it's completely real. The New Testament was not written in the order in which you read it. The first thing that was written down was not a gospel about Jesus' birth. It was not the cross. It was not the empty tomb. It was a letter, a nervous letter, written in a hurry, to a group of frightened people in a Greek city almost 20 years after Jesus died. And from there on, everything is stranger and more fascinating than you were taught. 27 texts that survived, while dozens of others that competed for the same spot were left out. Books that almost got in and didn't. Books that almost didn't get in and squeaked through. A 300-year process, copied by hand, letter by letter, for 15 centuries before a single printing press existed. Today, you're going to see that complete history. Not the catechism version, the real version, the one the scholars themselves argue over, with its dates, its proofs, and its honest gaps. You're going to understand why Paul wrote before the evangelists, what happened during those 20 years of silence, how 27 books beat out all the rest, and why, at the end of all this, you can hold that book and, most importantly, verify it for yourself. Before we begin, just one thing. If this kind of history, the real and verifiable kind, told without embellishment and without fear of the hard questions, is the kind you like to watch, give this video a like right now and write me in the comments which country you're joining us from today. That way someone else in this family who loves the truth manages to find it. And if you don't give it, no problem. You stay right here with me until the very last minute. Let's start with the place. Because to understand this book, you have to understand the world that made it possible, and that world looks nothing like the one you imagine. We're in a small strip of land on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, a troublesome, rebellious, poor province that gave Rome more problems than profit, Judea. Imagine walking through it in those years, paved roads the empire built to move legions, and that, without anyone knowing it, were going to serve to move something completely different. Soldiers in iron armor watching the crossroads, a huge temple, recently enlarged by Herod, gleaming in gold and white stone over Jerusalem, and an entire people waiting above all for one thing, for their God to break the silence, because that people had gone centuries without hearing a prophet. Almost no one knows this, and it's key. After Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, came almost 4 centuries of silence. 4 centuries in which, according to Jewish tradition itself, no prophetic voice arose. Heaven for them had fallen silent. And a people that believes its God has stopped speaking is a people that lives with its ear pressed to the door, waiting for the first creak. And in that silence, something enormous had happened in the outside world. 300 years earlier, A young king of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, had conquered everything in his path until he died exhausted in his 30s. Alexander died, his empire broke into pieces among his generals, but he left something that never broke apart: the language. Greek. Not the elegant Greek of the philosophers, but a simplified, street-level, marketplace version that everyone could speak from Egypt to Syria. That common tongue had a name: koine. The Greek word koine means literally common, what belongs to everyone. And that's exactly what it was, the first truly international language of the West. I want you to see the importance of this, because it's one of the quietest and most decisive gears in all of history. When the time comes for the story of Jesus to be written, it's not going to be written in the Aramaic he spoke in the streets of Galilee. It's going to be written in Koine, in the language a merchant in Rome, a soldier in Spain, and a tailor in Alexandria could all read alike. God, if you want to put it that way, chose to be born in the one moment of antiquity when a single language could carry a message to the whole known world. And there was more. Those 4 centuries of silence had also produced a book. The Jews who lived outside Israel, especially in Egypt, in the great city of Alexandria, hardly spoke Hebrew anymore. They spoke Greek, so they translated their own scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, into Koine Greek. That translation is called the Septuagint, and you'll sometimes see it written with the Latin letters LXX, which means 70, from the legend of the 72 sages who supposedly translated it. Remember this detail because it's enormous. When the authors of the New Testament quote the Old, most of the time they're not going to quote the original Hebrew. They're going to quote the Septuagint, the Greek version. The Old Testament that the first Christians read was already in good part a Greek book. Now lower your gaze to the streets of that occupied Judea. There was not a single kind of Jew. There were camps, parties, factions that hated one another. There were the Sadducees, the aristocracy of the temple, rich, religiously conservative but comfortable with Rome, who did not believe in the resurrection. There were the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, fanatics for detail, the ones who truly had the heart of the common people. There were the Essenes, separatists who had gone off to the desert to live in purity awaiting the end, and to whom we probably owe the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. And there were the Zealots, the radicals, the ones who thought the only answer to Rome was the dagger. And above all, those camps floated one same word, a burning hope that united them even as they despised one another: the Mashiach. In Hebrew, Mashiach means the anointed one, the one marked with oil for a mission from God, normally a king. When that word passed into Koine Greek, it was translated as Christos. And from there comes a title you repeat all the time without thinking: Christ. Christ is not Jesus' last name, it's an office. Christos, Mashiach, the Anointed One, the promised king who was going to break the silence of 4 centuries and throw the Romans into the sea. That was the air people breathed, an occupied people, a silent God, a universal language ready to be used, and a red-hot expectation that at any moment the Anointed One was going to appear. And then a man from Nazareth appeared, and he threw no one into the sea. Here begins the first great problem and the first great clue to how this book was born. Because Jesus wrote nothing, and it's not an oversight, it's a historical fact worth looking at head-on. The only moment in all the Gospels where it said that Jesus wrote anything was with his finger, in the dirt, in the scene of the woman caught in adultery, and tucked that fact into a pocket. Because at the end of this story, that same scene is going to give us one of the biggest surprises of all. For now, hold on to this. The founder of the most written about faith in history did not leave a single page in his own hand. So what was there during the first years? There was voice. There were people telling. A group of fishermen, women, repentant tax collectors, and curious people who repeated over and over what they had seen and heard. In Aramaic first, in Greek later. They recited it in homes, they told it on the roads, they argued about it in the synagogues. And this point is delicate, so let's be honest. Some people hear oral transmission and think of the game of telephone, where the message gets deformed from mouth to mouth. But first-century culture didn't work that way. It was a culture of trained memory, where disciples memorized their teachers word for word, where a saying was passed down with an almost liturgical care. Scholars have a Greek word for that which is handed from hand to hand, from generation to generation: paradosis. Paradosis means what is handed over, the tradition received. And it's the same word Paul is going to use when he says, "I handed on to you what I also received." For some 20, 30, even 40 years, the New Testament was not a book. It was living paradosis. It was people. Then comes the million-dollar question, the one that separates a story of faith from a verifiable story. Is there any proof outside the Bible that all this really happened? Did any Roman, any enemy, anyone who had no interest in this being true, write anything about this movement? The answer is yes, and it's one of the most solid and least told facts in this whole story. Let's travel to Rome, around the year 116. The most respected historian in the empire, a man named Tacitus, is writing his Annals, the chronicle of the emperors. He reaches the great fire of Rome of the year 64 and tells how the Emperor Nero, to get rid of the suspicion that he himself had started the fire, blamed it on a group hated by the people. And then Tacitus writes, with the cold contempt of a Roman aristocrat, that this group took its name from a certain Christ, who had been executed under the governor Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Read that again. A Roman historian, a pagan who detested the Christians and called them a pernicious superstition, unwittingly confirms 3 facts of the New Testament: that he existed, how he died, and under whom. He didn't write it to help the faith. He wrote it the way you'd note down a plague, and he's not alone. A few years earlier, around the year 112, a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger writes an anguished letter to the Emperor Trajan. It's an administrative letter, real, that still exists. Pliny doesn't know what to do with these Christians multiplying in his province. He tells how he interrogates them, that some confess under torture, and he describes how they gather before dawn to sing hymns to Christ as to a god. Again, a Roman official with no religious interest, documenting that these people existed, that they were growing, and that they worshipped Jesus as divine barely a few decades after the cross. And there's still more. The biographer Suetonius, in his Life of the Emperor Nero, mentions the punishment of the Christians, and there's a historian who is pure gold for us, because he was Jewish, not Christian, Flavius Josephus. In his great work on the history of his people, Josephus mentions Jesus twice. One of them, almost all scholars consider secure. When he narrates the execution of a man named James, he identifies him as the brother of Jesus, the one called Christos. The other mention is more famous and more disputed, and here I have to be completely honest with you, because this channel won't sell you smoke. That longer passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, reached us with phrases so Christian. This was the Christ. He rose on the 3rd day, that a Jew like Josephus would never have written them. The conclusion of most experts is not that it's all false, nor that it's all true. It's that Josephus wrote something real about Jesus, and that Christian copyists of later centuries added embellishments from their own faith. The core is authentic, the touch-ups are not, and that a Christian channel tells you that to your face should tell you that here the truth weighs more than the propaganda. Add it all up. Before the New Testament existed as a book, the enemies of Christianity were already writing about it. Rome noted it down. A Jewish historian noted it down. There's a Greek word that runs through the whole New Testament and explains why those people were willing to die rather than be silent. Martis. Martis means simply witness. But because so many of those witnesses ended up dead for refusing to be quiet about what they had seen, the word changed meaning forever. From martis comes our word martyr. Witness and martyr ended up being the same thing, and that's the raw material with which at last someone sat down to write. Except the first one who sat down to write was none of the 12. It was the man who had persecuted them the most. His name was Saul. He was from Tarsus, a cultured Greek-speaking city. He was a Pharisee, a student of the best teachers, and he hated the Jesus movement with a textbook hatred. He approved executions. He went house by house, dragging believers to prison. If you had to bet on who would never write a single word in favor of the Christians, you would have bet on him. And it's exactly him who writes the first words of the New Testament. Something happened to him on the road to Damascus. He tells it as an encounter with the risen Jesus. His critics explain it in other ways, and that's a conversation for another day. But the historical result is indisputable. The number one persecutor became the most tireless traveler and the most prolific writer of the entire first Christian generation. He even changed his name. Saul became Paul, and he launched himself onto the roads of the empire for almost 30 years, founding small communities of believers in city after city. And now comes the reversal that changes everything. When Paul founded one of those communities and then traveled on, those communities were left alone, with questions, with internal fights, with doubts, with heresies cropping up. And Paul, from afar, did the only thing he could do. He wrote to them. A letter to put out a fire here, another to settle a quarrel there, another to console some who were weeping for their dead. Those urgent, practical letters written for the concrete problems of concrete people are the oldest surviving texts of Christianity. The oldest of all he wrote to the community in the city of Thessalonica, and that's why we call it 1 Thessalonians. Most scholars date it around the year 50, 51. I want you to let that number land. The year 50. That's barely some 20 years after the crucifixion. And it's at least 15 years before the first gospel was written. When Paul sends that letter, there's still no Matthew, no Mark, no Luke, no John. There's none of them. The first thing the nascent faith put in writing and preserved was not the story of Jesus' birth. It was a letter to some frightened Christians who were afraid that their dead loved ones had missed the Lord's return. And to be totally honest, there's a finer detail still. Some experts believe there's an even earlier letter, the one to the Galatians, which could be from around the year 48, on the basis of a very specific argument about a council that had not yet happened when Paul wrote it. Thessalonians or Galatians, the point doesn't change. The first thing in the New Testament was a letter of Paul's, and the Gospels came afterward. Now, why does this matter so much? Because it completely changes what you hold in your hands when you read a letter of Paul's. You're not reading a treatise of theology written calmly for posterity. You're reading, literally, one side of a conversation. It's as if you opened someone's phone and read only the messages he sent to a group in the middle of a crisis, without seeing the replies. That's why Paul sometimes seems to answer questions you didn't hear, because you weren't in the group. The Corinthians were. When you understand that the epistles are occasional documents, emergency messages, you stop reading them as a cold code and start hearing a real man, exhausted, fighting to keep an idea alive at a distance. And buried inside one of those letters is a bomb that makes historians tremble. In the first letter to the Corinthians, written around the year 53 or 54, Paul pauses and says a phrase almost in passing. I handed on to you what I also received. Remember that word. What is handed on, what is received, paradosis. And then he recites something he clearly did not invent, something that sounds like a formula, like a memorized creed. That Christ died for our sins, that he was buried, that he rose on the third day, and that he appeared to Peter, to the 12, and to more than 500 at once. Scholars look at that little block and their skin crawls because it's not Paul's. It's something Paul received from others that was already circulating before him, a confession that many specialists date to very few years after the death of Jesus. Maybe 3, maybe 5. That means the central summary of the Christian faith, he died, was buried, rose, is not a legend that grew slowly over centuries. It's documented inside a letter as something that was already old, barely a handful of years after the cross. It's the earliest fossil of the faith, and it's embedded inside an epistle. But, and here, honesty comes in again, because I promised you the real history. Not all the letters that bear Paul's name are treated the same by scholars, and this is a genuine academic debate worth knowing. There are 7 letters that practically no one disputes. Romans, the 2 to the Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and the little note to Philemon. These are called the undisputed letters, the ones that with near total certainty came from his hand. The others, Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and above all the 3 called pastorals, the 2 to Timothy and the 1 to Titus, are debated. Some experts note differences in vocabulary, in style, in situation, and propose that they were written by disciples of Paul after his death, using his name to prolong his voice, a practice that in the ancient world was not seen as a lie, but as a tribute. Other experts defend them as authentic and explain the differences by the use of secretaries. The ancients almost never wrote in their own hand. They dictated to a scribe, or simply because a man changes his tone depending on whom he's writing to and at what age. The clean truth, there's no closed verdict, and an honest channel presents it to you as what it is, an open debate, not a resolved dogma. I want you to see for a moment what it was really like to receive one of these letters, because it's going to change the picture for you forever. Imagine you're part of a small Christian community in a house in Rome. There are 20, 30 people packed into a borrowed room by the light of oil lamps. Most don't know how to read. In that world, reading was a luxury of the few. And one day, someone arrives dusty from the road. According to the letter to the Romans itself, it was a woman named Phoebe who carried it, with a hand-sewn scroll. There is one single copy of that text in the world, one, and someone who does know how to read stands up, unrolls the papyrus, and reads aloud, slowly, for everyone. That's what an epistle was, not a book each person had on their nightstand, but a voice that crossed the sea inside a scroll and sounded again, aloud, in a room full of people holding their breath. And when it was over, the community copied it by hand to send to the community next door. Paul himself, in the letter to the Colossians, gives the order. When you finish reading this one, exchange it with the one from Laodicea, and read that one too. Do you realize what's happening there, almost without anyone planning it? The letters begin to travel. They get copied, lent, gathered. One community keeps 2 or 3, another gets copies and builds its own pile. Without any committee deciding it, without any order from above, the letters of Paul begin to circulate together like a collection forming on its own from church to church, while the man is still alive and writing, until he stopped writing. Around the year 67 or 68 in Rome, under the persecution of Nero, tradition says Paul was executed. And almost at the same time, according to the same tradition, the other pillar of the first generation also falls, Peter, The two greatest witnesses, the two most important martyrs, dead within a few years of each other. And that, though it sounds like an ending, was actually the trigger for the next stage. Because while the witnesses lived, no one felt the urgency to write down their story. It was enough to ask them. The problem is, what happens when the witnesses start to die? Because between the years 60 and 70, the world of those first Christians fell apart in three ways at the same time. First, their two giants, Peter and Paul, had been executed. Second, the generation that had truly walked with Jesus, the one that could say, "I was there, I saw him," was dying off one by one of old age or by the sword. And third, the catastrophe came. In the year 70, after a Jewish rebellion against Rome, the legions of the general Titus leveled Jerusalem and burned the temple to its foundations. The heart of the Jewish world, the place where God dwelt according to that people, turned to smoke. For many, it literally seemed like the end of the world. Put those three things together and you'll understand the urgency. The witnesses were dying, the city was burning, and the paradosis, that chain of living memory passed from mouth to mouth, ran the risk of breaking forever. If no one put in writing what those witnesses told, in one more generation there would be no one left to tell it. It was then, and not before, that someone finally made the decision to fix the story in ink. And to the product of that decision, they gave a name that again comes from Greek and hides an enormous provocation. They called it Evangelion. You know it as gospel, and you probably think it means something religious and vague. No, Evangelion means good news, the announcement of glad tidings. And it was a word of the empire. When an heir to the emperor was born, when a general won a great battle, heralds went through the cities announcing the Evangelion of Caesar. It was imperial propaganda. So when these persecuted Christians took that very word and used it to announce a peasant executed as the true king of the world, they were stealing the empire's vocabulary right to its face. The Evangelion was no longer the good news of Caesar. It was the good news of a crucified man. That, in that context, was almost a declaration of war. The first of those four accounts to be written was, almost certainly, that of Mark, around the year 65 or 70. And if you ever read it straight through, you'll notice something. It's the shortest, the rawest, the most hurried. Everything happens at once, immediately, one scene after another with no breathing room, as if the writer had a racing heart. The oldest tradition, recorded by a bishop named Papias at the beginning of the 2nd century, says that Mark was not a direct witness, but the interpreter of Peter, that he put in writing the preaching of Peter himself just as he had heard it. A second-hand account, yes, but from the hand of someone who was indeed there. And it ends in a very strange, abrupt way, with some women fleeing, terrified from the empty tomb, saying nothing to anyone. Remember that strange ending? Because when we get to the manuscripts, I'm going to show you something about that ending that almost no one knows. Now appears one of the most fascinating enigmas in the whole New Testament, and it's known as the synoptic problem. Let me explain it without jargon. If you put the accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, you discover something that can't be a coincidence. They tell a great many identical scenes in the same order, and sometimes with the exact same words in Greek, comma by comma. That doesn't happen when three different people remember the same thing on their own. That happens when they're copying one another or when they share a common written source. There's a literary relationship among the three. The explanation with the most support today is that Mark came first, and that both Matthew and Luke had it in front of them and used it as a base, each adding his own material. And since Matthew and Luke also share certain sayings of Jesus that aren't in Mark, many researchers propose that there existed another source, a lost collection of sayings which they call Q, And I'm going to be direct with you, because it's important, that Q source is a hypothesis, not a fact. No one has ever found it. It's a very reasonable theory to explain the coincidences, but it's that, a theory, and there's no shortage of those who reject it and propose other solutions. When someone talks to you about Q as if it were a proven document, you now know more than they do. Back to the accounts. Matthew and Luke are written later, between the years 80 and 90, and each with a different audience in mind, which explains why they tell of the same Jesus in such different ways. Matthew writes for a Jewish audience, and that's why he paints Jesus for you as a new Moses, going up a mountain to give the law, fulfilling prophecy after prophecy of the Old Testament. Luke, on the other hand, writes like a historian. He begins his work dedicating it to a certain Theophilus and saying openly that he investigated everything carefully in an orderly way so that his reader would have certainty. Luke is the reporter of the group. And notice something enormous that almost no one catches. Luke did not write a single book. He wrote 2. His account about Jesus, and as a second part, the story of what happened afterward, the book of Acts. Luke and Acts are a single work in 2 volumes, by the same author, split in 2 by the order of the Bible. And finally, between the year 90 and 100, almost at the end of the 1st century, the 4th account is written, that of John. And anyone who reads attentively feels the change immediately. John doesn't resemble the other 3. He has almost no parables. There's no birth in Bethlehem, nor temptation in the desert. Instead, there are long discourses, there's a deep, almost poetic language, and there's a Jesus who speaks openly of his divine origin from the very first page, that famous, "In the beginning was the Word." While the first 3 show you Jesus from the street, John shows him to you from heaven. It's the latest, the most reflected upon, the fruit of decades of meditating on what all of it meant. And now get ready, because here comes one of the facts that most shakes people when they hear it for the first time, and it's completely real. The 4 Gospels, in their original form, were anonymous. They had no signature. Mark doesn't begin by saying, "I, Mark." Matthew doesn't sign his work. The names you know, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, are titles the church gave them afterward in the 2nd century, based on the tradition about who was behind each text. The first to attach those names to them were men like Papias at the beginning of the 2nd century, and above all, Irenaeus, around the year 180, who argued forcefully that there had to be exactly 4, no more, no less. And I want you to understand well what this means and what it doesn't mean, because here a lot of people exaggerate one way or the other. It doesn't mean the Gospels are fake or that they have no connection to those men. The tradition that assigned them the names is ancient, and there are good arguments in its favor. But neither does it mean we have an autographed signature. The honest truth, the one a serious scholar will tell you, is this. The authorship of the Gospels rests on the tradition of the 2nd century church, and scholars debate how far that tradition is right. Neither absolute certainty nor absolute invention, early tradition, open debate. That simple and that honest. Let me take you for a moment to the instant in which one of those accounts might have been born. Imagine a man already old in a humble house in some corner of the empire. He's one of the last who, as a young man, heard Peter preach in person. His friends from those years are all dead now. He feels his time is running out. And one afternoon, he calls someone younger who does know how to write, sets sheets of papyrus before him, and begins to dictate, slowly, everything he remembers. What Peter told of the lake, of the crowds, of the last night, of the morning of the tomb. He doesn't do it to become famous. He does it because he knows that when he closes his eyes, that voice goes out forever if it doesn't remain in ink. It's a race against death. And the prize of that race, without his imagining it, ended up being the most read book in history. Even so, The four accounts and the letters of Paul were not, by a long shot, everything that was being written. There was much more, and part of that much more was going to provoke the hardest fights of the coming centuries. Let's start with the second half of Luke's work, the Book of Acts. And I want you to value what it is, because it's unique. Acts is the only account we have of what happened in the first decades of the church, after Jesus left the scene. Without Acts, we would know almost nothing about how a handful of frightened Galileans, shut in a room, became a movement that within a generation was already knocking on the doors of Rome. Acts is literally the bridge. It begins in Jerusalem with the disciples and ends with Paul preaching in the capital of the empire. It's the hinge that joins the story of Jesus with the letters we already read. When you read an epistle of Paul's and wonder what city he was in, what quarrel he had, where he was going afterward, the answer is almost always in Acts. The 2 volumes of Luke are, together, almost a quarter of the entire New Testament. A single author wrote more pages than anyone else, including Paul. After Acts come some letters that tradition grouped under a curious name, the Catholic letters. And careful, here Catholic has nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church. The Greek word just means universal, general. They're called that because, unlike Paul's, they're not addressed to a single community with a single problem, but to believers in general. There's the letter of James, intensely practical, insisting that faith without works is dead, a phrase that generated tension with Paul's emphasis on faith, to the point that some throughout history noticed the contrast and debated how they fit together. There are the 2 letters attributed to Peter. There are the 3 letters of John, 2 of them so small they'd fit on a postcard. And there's the brief and fierce letter of Jude. And among all those texts, there's one that is, without dispute, the greatest literary mystery of the entire New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews. Read it, and you're going to find an elegant, polished Greek, among the most refined in the whole book, and a deep theology about Jesus as high priest. There's only one problem. It doesn't say who wrote it. It has no signature, no opening greeting with a name, nothing. For centuries in the West, they put it in Paul's group in order to be able to accept it, but almost no one really believed it was his, because neither the style nor the voice are his. And then comes one of my favorite sentences in all of church history. In the 3rd century, one of the most brilliant scholars of Christian antiquity, Origen, after analyzing in depth who could have written Hebrews, gave up with an honesty that's a joy. He said in a few words that as to who really wrote it, only God knows. That was said by a genius who lived barely 2 centuries from the events. If he didn't know, imagine us. To this day, the author of Hebrews is unknown, and that anonymity almost cost it a place outside the book. Because that's exactly what many of these shorter and later texts have in common. They were the most debated. Not all the books got into the New Testament with the same ease. The 4 Gospels and the great letters of Paul were never in doubt. They were used everywhere from very early on. But several of the little ones, 2 Peter, the minor letters of John, the one of Jude, the one of James, Hebrews, spent generations on a kind of waiting list, accepted in some regions and viewed with suspicion in others. Hold on to that idea of a waiting list, because it's the key to the last great part of this story. Except before we get there, we're missing one book, number 27, and it's, without any doubt, the strangest, the most feared, and the most misunderstood of all. Close your eyes a second and imagine a rocky island, small, lost in the Aegean Sea. It's called Patmos. It's a Roman penal colony, a place of exile. And there, around the year 95, during a wave of imperial pressure that tradition associates with the Emperor Domitian, there's an old exiled Christian named John. Who exactly this John is debated. Whether it's the apostle or some other leader of the same name, scholars don't agree. and it's worth knowing. But the man alone on that rock begins to have visions, and he puts them in writing in the most hallucinatory and terrifying book in the whole Bible. We call it Apocalypse, and it's worth making one of the most important corrections in this whole video, because the word has fooled you your whole life. When you hear apocalypse, you think of the end of the world, of destruction, of catastrophe, but the Greek word apocalypsis doesn't mean that. It means, literally, to uncover what was covered, to lift the veil, revelation. An apocalypsis is not a disaster. It's an unveiling. It's pulling back the curtain to show what's really happening behind the stage of the world. That's why in many Bibles, that book isn't called Apocalypse, but Revelation. It's the same word, and understanding the genre changes everything. Apocalyptic literature was a very well-known type of writing in the Jewish world, and it had a concrete function. It was resistance literature for persecuted people. It was written in code, in symbols, precisely so that the insiders would understand and the censors of the empire would not. That's why Revelation is full of beasts, of numbers, of a great prostitute called Babylon. To a Roman who intercepted it, it was the raving of a madman. To a persecuted Christian who knew the code, it was crystal clear. The beast was the empire, Babylon was Rome, and the message, beneath all the terrifying symbolism, was of a brutal simplicity. Hold on, because the empire that crushes you today is going to fall, and the Lamb wins in the end. It was not a manual for predicting the future. It was a pamphlet of hope coded so they wouldn't be killed for writing it. And because it was so strange, so visionary, and so easy to misinterpret, Revelation was one of the books that had the hardest time getting into the New Testament. In the eastern half of Christianity, in Greek, there were churches that doubted it for centuries. It was, like Hebrews, like 2 Peter, on that long waiting list. So stop and look at the panorama. By the end of the 1st century, there already existed, written and circulating, the 27 texts that today form your New Testament. But, and this is what almost no one understands, they did not yet exist as a book. They existed as a disordered pile of loose scrolls, copied by hand, scattered throughout the empire, mixed with a great many other Christian writings that were fighting for the same spot. No one yet had the New Testament in their hands. They had pieces. And the most explosive question of this whole story is precisely this: who, how, and why decided that those 27 and not others were the books of God? The answer is going to surprise you, because it's not the one you saw in the movies. There's an idea a great many people have stuck in their heads, and it almost always comes from novels and movies, like a certain bestseller about a code and symbols. The idea is this: that at a great council, the Emperor Constantine and a group of bishops sat around a table, voted by a show of hands on which books got into the Bible and which didn't, chose their 27 favorites for political reasons, and ordered all the rest burned. It sounds dramatic. It sounds like a conspiracy. And it's false. Historically false. The council people usually point to is the one at Nicaea of the year 325. And here's the fact that dismantles everything. At Nicaea, the subject of which books made up the New Testament was not dealt with. The Bible was not voted on there. Nicaea discussed something else, the nature of Christ, a completely different matter. The legend that the Bible was assembled at Nicaea by order of an emperor doesn't appear in any document of the period. It appears in a 21st century novel. So forget the table, the vote, and the imperial bonfire. The truth is much slower, much more human, and to me, much more interesting. And before we go on, a quick question for the comments. Were you also sold at some point the idea that the Bible was decided at Nicaea by order of an emperor? Write me down below if you believed that myth. You're not the only one. And the real history is much stranger than any conspiracy. What really happened was not a top-down decision, but a bottom-up recognition. For 200–300 years, the Christian communities throughout the empire kept using certain texts in their gatherings. They read them aloud, preached on them, copied them, sent them to other churches. And little by little, almost by their own weight, the texts that were used everywhere kept floating to the top, while the ones used little or in a single corner kept falling behind. It wasn't a committee that chose, it was the use of entire generations that settled it out. Like a river that over time separates the gold from the sand on its own. But every process needs a trigger. And the trigger for the church to begin putting its books in order was, ironically, a heretic. Around the year 144 in Rome, a rich and brilliant man named Marcion arrived with a radical idea. Marcion hated the Old Testament. He thought the violent God of the Old Testament could not be the same loving Father Jesus spoke of, and he proposed throwing the whole Old Testament in the trash. And for his version of Christianity, he assembled his own list of sacred texts, a trimmed-down Gospel of Luke, from which he had removed anything that sounded too Jewish, plus 10 letters of Paul, also edited to his taste, and nothing more. That was, as scandalous as it sounds, the first closed list of Christian books in history. And it was a heretic's. Do you see the irony? The mainstream church had never felt the need to make an official list, because it occurred to no one to argue about it. But when Marcion put his trimmed-down canon on the table and began to win followers, the rest were forced to react and to ask themselves seriously for the first time, wait a minute, and which are really our books? Marcion, without meaning to, lit the fuse. He forced the church to define what until then it had left in a comfortable vagueness. And when the church set about defining, it didn't choose at random or out of political whim. It used criteria, 3 above all, that are worth knowing because they dismantle the idea of pure power. The first was apostolicity. Does this text go back to an apostle or to someone very close to an apostle? The second was universal use. Do the churches read it everywhere or only an isolated little group? And the third was orthodoxy. Does what it teaches agree with the faith that was received, that paradosis that came from the original witnesses? Apostolic, used everywhere, faithful to what was received. Those were the filters. And to that list of texts that passed the filters, over time they gave a name taken from Greek, canon. Canon originally meant a straight reed, a measuring stick, a rule. From there comes the word canon. The canon was not a list of favorites. It was the rule, the rod by which it was measured what was scripture and what was not. We have physical proof that this process was gradual and not instantaneous. There exists an ancient document discovered centuries later by a scholar named Muratorian, which we call the Muratorian fragment. It is, possibly, one of the oldest lists of Christian books we have. Its date is debated between the 2nd century and the 4th. And it's fascinating because it already resembles your New Testament quite a bit, but it's not identical. It's missing some of the books you have today, and it mentions a couple that aren't there today. It's a snapshot of the list half-cooked, an intermediate stage captured in time, and 2 beautiful Greek words come onto the scene that are going to stick with you. At the beginning of the 4th century, a church historian named Josephus did something very orderly. He took all the Christian texts in circulation and classified them into groups. The books accepted by everyone without dispute, he called homologumena, which means the ones everyone confesses alike, the unanimously recognized, and the ones on that famous waiting list, accepted by some and doubted by others, he called antilegomena, which means, literally, the contradicted, the ones that are disputed. And who was among the antilegomena, among the disputed? Well, several old acquaintances of ours, the letter of James, the one of Jude, 2 Peter, the minor letters of John, and in some lists, even Revelation. The Bible, for a good while, had first-class books and books on probation. Now the part that truly raises goosebumps. The books that almost got in and were left out by very little. Because it wasn't that in the pile there were only the 27 and a lot of obvious garbage. There were serious, orthodox, beloved Christian texts that were in fact read in the churches and that came within a hair of staying inside the New Testament. The Shepherd of Hermas, a very popular work. The Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, a kind of manual of the early church. The letter called First Clement. And here comes the most impressive proof of all, one you can verify yourself. When we look at the oldest complete Bibles that survived, the great handwritten jewels, we find that they carry those extra books inside. The Codex Sinaiticus, from the 4th century, one of the oldest Bibles on the planet, includes within its New Testament the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. The Codex Alexandrinus, from the 5th century, includes 1st and 2nd Clement. Read it again. The oldest physical Bibles we have contain books your Bible today no longer has. The line of what got in and what didn't was still being drawn in pencil, not in indelible ink. And the famous forbidden Gospels, the one of Thomas, the one of Judas, all those that show up in sensationalist documentaries. They were also left out, but not because of a conspiracy to hide the truth. They were left out because they failed the filters. Almost all of them were written much later, in the 2nd century or after, too far from the original witnesses. Almost all of them bore false names of apostles to give themselves authority. A practice that has its own word, apocryphous texts, from the Greek hidden, concealed, from which comes apocryphal. And almost all of them taught a different theology, often that of Gnosticism, which clashed with the received faith. They didn't pass the filter of antiquity, nor that of broad use, nor that of orthodoxy. Power didn't hide them. The rule the churches were already using left them out. And then, at last, we reach the date, the year 367. A bishop of Alexandria named Athanasius, one of the most important theologians of his time, sends his annual Easter letter to the churches under his care, his 39th festal letter. In that letter, among other things, he makes a list of the books he considers scripture, and for the first time in all documented history, that New Testament list contains exactly the 27 books you have today. Not one more, not one less. Those 4 Gospels, Acts, the letters, Revelation. The first perfect snapshot of your New Testament appears in a 4th century Easter letter. But, and this is key so as not to exaggerate, Athanasius did not invent that list out of nothing, nor impose it by force. What he did was put in writing, with authority, what had already become the consensus of the churches. And a few decades later, 2 councils in North Africa, the one at Hippo in the year 393 and the one at Carthage in 397, officially confirmed that same list. Notice the verb carefully. Confirmed. They didn't choose, they didn't vote among options blindly, they didn't invent. They ratified what the Christian communities had already been using for generations. The councils were the final seal of a process of centuries, not its beginning. And to close this part with total honesty, because I promised it to you, not even with Athanasius did everything stay settled forever and for everyone. The discussion about some book kept dragging on in some corners for a long time. It wasn't until the 16th century that the Protestant reformers reaffirmed their list, and the Catholic Church officially fixed its own as dogma at the Council of Trent in response. The New Testament did not fall from heaven bound, nor was it imposed by an emperor in an afternoon. It rose from below, book by book, church by church, over centuries, until the Christian world recognized in those 27 texts the voice of the original witnesses. And now, when you already know which books they are and how they came to be together, the final question remains, the most practical of all, the one that decides whether all this is worth anything or not. We have the right books. Good. But how do we know that the text we read today, after 1,500 years of copies by hand, still says what the original said? Here I have to give you news that seems devastating and that most people don't know. Those originals, those first papyri that came from the hand of Paul, of the one who wrote Mark, of the old man who dictated to Luke, the physical sheets the authors touched, they don't exist. We don't have a single one, not one autograph, which is what the specialists call the original manuscript. Zero. Papyrus is a fragile material, made from a river plant. With humidity it rots, with use it breaks, with the years it crumbles into dust. Those first sheets were read, copied, read again until they wore out, and disappeared almost 2,000 years ago. What you hold in your hands today does not descend directly from the originals. It descends from copies. Copies of copies of copies, made by hand, one by one, for more than 1,000 years before the printing press existed. And right there, in that sentence, beats the fear of any honest person. If it's all copies made by hand by tired human beings by candlelight, how do we know they didn't change everything along the way? How do we know the message didn't get deformed, like in that game of telephone, where a phrase goes in one end and comes out turned into something else at the other? It's the right question. It's the question you have to ask. And the answer is one of the most fascinating things in this whole story, because it goes exactly against what your intuition expects. Let's start with the most surprising part. The way to know what the original said when the original is lost is to have many copies. The more independent copies you have, scattered across more different places, made in more different eras, the easier it is to compare and reconstruct the text. If you only had one copy, you'd be at its mercy. You'd have to believe it blindly. But if you have thousands, made by people who never knew one another, in countries that never spoke to each other, the errors of one give themselves away when they collide with the rest. And here comes the fact almost no one tells you. Of the New Testament, there survive, in Greek alone, its original language, more than 5,800 catalogued manuscripts. 5,800, from tiny fragments the size of a card to entire Bibles. Now, let's be exact, because that number is often used with a trick. The vast majority of those copies are medieval, from quite a few centuries later, and from the first centuries, barely a handful survive, the oldest being precisely those minuscule fragments. Except that doesn't sink the argument, and you'll see why. To reconstruct a lost text, it's not necessary for every copy to be ancient. It's necessary to have very many independent copies that check one another, plus a few very early ones that anchor the rest. And if you add the ancient copies in Latin, in Syriac, in Coptic, in Armenian, in other languages it was translated into early, the figure climbs to tens of thousands of witnesses. For you to feel what that number means, you have to compare it. Let's take the most famous work of all Greek antiquity, the Iliad of Homer, the second ancient text with the most preserved copies in the world. The second. And it doesn't come close. The Greek copies of Homer number in the hundreds, maybe a couple thousand if you're generous, of almost any other classical author, Plato, Aristotle, the great Roman historians. Handfuls survive. Sometimes dozens of copies, sometimes of entire works, barely 2 or 3 complete manuscripts on the whole planet, and the oldest was copied 1,000 years after the author died. 1,000 years of darkness between the original and the oldest copy we have, and no one doubts that we read those authors. The New Testament plays in a completely different league. Not only does it have an avalanche of copies, but some are astonishingly early. And that brings us to the most precious object in this whole hunt, a little piece of papyrus, smaller than the palm of your hand, written on both sides, that today is kept in a library in the city of Manchester. They call it the Rylands fragment, or the fragment of John, because on it you can read a few phrases from the Gospel of John, right from the passage where Jesus is before Pilate. And let me be honest with you, as I've been the whole way, because here a lot of people exaggerate. For a long time it was said that little piece dated from around the year 125, barely a generation after the Gospel of John was written. Today, several specialists dispute that date and open it to a wider window, perhaps even some decades later. We're not going to fake a precision that doesn't exist. But even with the most cautious date, think about what you have before you. A physical piece of a gospel, copied so close to its origin that the ink is almost still fresh in historical terms. Of no other ancient text do we preserve anything like that. Of none. All right, we have a mountain of copies, and some extremely early. But let's be rigorous, because I promise total honesty. Those thousands and thousands of copies, made by hand by human beings, are they identical to one another? No. And it's right here that most people, when they find out, get scared. Among all those manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of differences have been counted. They're called variants, and a critic of Christianity will tell you with a triumphant look that there are more differences among the copies than there are words in the New Testament. It sounds devastating until you understand what kind of differences they are. The vast majority, and I mean the enormous, overwhelming majority, are insignificant. Spelling errors, a word written with one extra letter, the order of two words switched, which in Greek doesn't alter the meaning because it's a language that's understood the same way. A copyist who skipped a line because two lines ended in the same word and his eye jumped. A scribe who wrote Christ Jesus where another put Jesus Christ. If you gather all those variants and classify them, you discover that the quantity that truly affects the meaning of something, and that also has real chances of being the original, is minuscule. And the discipline that takes charge of combing through those thousands of manuscripts, comparing each difference and reconstructing with very high probability what the lost text said, has a name. It's called textual criticism. It's not faith. It's almost detective work, of the magnifying glass, of comparing witnesses, of tracing what region and what era each reading comes from, like someone solving a crime with many imperfect witness accounts. And now comes the part where I'm going to look you in the eye, because an honest channel doesn't hide the uncomfortable pieces from you. There are a handful of passages, very few but famous, where the differences among the manuscripts really are large, of entire verses, and where the best specialists openly acknowledge that they weren't in the originals or that they're very doubtful. I'm not going to hide them from you. I'm going to show them to you one by one. The first. Open the Gospel of Mark, the oldest, remember? The one that ended so abruptly. The women find the empty tomb. A young man announces to them that Jesus has risen, and they flee trembling, afraid, saying nothing to anyone. Period. Right there. Cut off. Mark ended in the oldest and best quality manuscripts we have. But in your Bible, there are probably 12 more verses after that, where Jesus appears, gives instructions, talks about picking up serpents and drinking poison without dying. Well, it's been known for a long time that that long ending of Mark was almost certainly added later by copyists uncomfortable with such an abrupt close who wanted to round out the story. It's not a hidden secret. Your own Bible, if you look at the footnote, warns you of it. That honesty is printed right there, in plain sight of everyone. The second, and this one is going to shake you because it closes a circle I opened with you at the very beginning. Do you remember the first sentence of this video? That no one wrote a single line about Jesus while he walked, and I told you there was a single scene in the Gospels where it said that Jesus himself wrote something with his finger in the dirt. That scene, the one of the woman caught in adultery, whom he saves by saying, "Let the one who is without sin throw the first stone," is one of the most beloved passages in the whole Bible. And here's what almost no one knows. That account doesn't appear in the oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. It floats. Some copies put it in one place, others in another, others stick it inside Luke, and the oldest simply don't have it. Almost all specialists agree that it wasn't part of the original John, but that it's a very ancient and probably true story about Jesus, which circulated loose for generations, and that the copyists, wisely, didn't want to lose, and ended up embedding in the text. Think about it a second. The only scene where Jesus writes in a story about throwing stones and forgiving is itself a story that had to be rescued by hand from oblivion. Ink saving ink again. And the third, so as not to leave you any easy piece out. In the first letter of John, there's a verse that in some old Bibles explicitly and roundly mentions the three divine persons, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, as three that are one. It sounds like the perfect proof. The problem is that that phrase, known as the Johannine comma, is not in any of the ancient Greek manuscripts. It appears very late, it slips in first in Latin copies, and very probably it was born as a marginal note that a copyist, centuries later, raised into the body of the text. Today, practically no serious translation includes it without a warning or leaves it out entirely. And notice something enormous, that textual criticism is capable of detecting an addition like that, and of removing it doesn't weaken the text. It cleans it. It proves the method works, that the scalpel cuts both ways, that no one is protecting comfortable additions. So what's left for us, after looking at all this without makeup? This, that among the hundreds of thousands of variants, the truly disputed passages of large size can be counted on the fingers of your hands, and your own Bible points them out to you with footnotes. That none of those variants cast doubt on what Christianity teaches at its center, not who Jesus claimed to be, not his death, not the announcement of his resurrection, not the heart of his message. That was already there, solid, in the oldest fossil we saw. That creed tucked into a letter 3 to 5 years from the cross. And here's the great paradox, the one I want you to take with you. What seemed the greatest weakness of the New Testament, being a text copied by hand thousands of times over 1,000 years, turned out to be, thanks to the brutal quantity of copies and the work of textual criticism, the ancient text whose content we can reconstruct with more confidence than any other in the world. Not because they ask you to believe it, because you can go and see it. The copies exist, the fragments exist, the footnotes exist. It's all on the table. But knowing that the text is reconstructed doesn't answer a question that's even more physical, more flesh and blood. How on earth did this book cross 1,500 years, empires that fell, languages that died, fires, wars, and oblivion to reach your hand intact? Because between those papyri that crumbled and the Bible you open today in a second on your phone, there's one of the most incredible chains of custody any object has ever lived through. And almost no one knows the silent heroes of that chain. The first leap was made by some giant books. As Christianity stopped being persecuted and came out into the light, someone could finally afford something very expensive, to copy the whole sacred text, complete, not on fragile papyrus but on parchment, which is treated animal skin, much more resistant, capable of lasting centuries. From that era, from the 4th century and the 5th, 3 treasures survived that are the backbone of everything we know. One is kept today in the heart of the Vatican. Another, the most dramatic of all, was rescued in the 19th century from a monastery in the desert at the foot of Mount Sinai, and it's that same extremely ancient Bible that, remember, still included a couple of books that in the end didn't get into the list, and a third traveled to a library in London. These codices are like time capsules. Every time a specialist wants to know what the text really said, they go down to them. To that lettering written by an anonymous hand 1600 years ago. Now then, most of the world back then didn't read Greek. They spoke Latin, and onto the scene comes one of the key characters in the whole history of the book, a brilliant, grumpy, and genial scholar named Jerome. Around the year 400, shut away to work, according to tradition, near Bethlehem, Jerome undertook a monstrous task: to translate the whole Bible into a clear Latin, the Latin of the people. That translation was called the Vulgate, precisely because it was the common version, the one of the common folk, of everyone. And it was not just another translation. It was the Bible of the West for 1,000 years, 1,000 years. Every cathedral, every nascent university, every king crowned in Europe heard the scriptures in the words that ill-tempered man chose in his cell. Few translations in human history have weighed so much, and between the Vulgate and the printing press opens the quietest and most moving chapter of all. 1,000 years in which there were no machines, no copies in series, no way to multiply a book except one alone, by hand, letter by letter, by a human being. I want you to stop here with me, because to these men we owe, literally, that you have a Bible. Imagine a monastery in the middle of a medieval winter in some corner of Europe, a cold room called a scriptorium, the place of writing, rows of monks bent over lecterns in absolute silence for hours. A monk is not praying with his mouth, he's copying, dipping a bird's feather in ink, tracing one letter and another and another. His back hurts, his fingers go numb in the cold. In the margins of some manuscripts we preserve, those copyists left little complaints written in secret. That they were cold, that the light was bad, that their eyes hurt, that they wished it would end soon. A single book of the Bible could take him months. A whole Bible, years of a life, and they did it knowing that an error of theirs would be copied 1,000 times. Generation after generation of anonymous men ruining their eyesight so the chain wouldn't break. Every Bible that exists today rests, without knowing it, on the aching shoulders of those forgotten copyists. And then, in the middle of the 15th century, the bomb exploded that changed everything forever. A German goldsmith named Gutenberg perfected a machine with movable metal type, the printing press. And of all the things he could have printed first, do you know which one he chose as his great inaugural work? The Bible, the Latin Vulgate. For the first time in history, a book stopped taking years to copy and started coming out in quantities, identical, page after page, without anyone's tired hand introducing new errors. What a monk took a whole lifetime to produce, the machine spat out in weeks. It was, for its time, an explosion as big as the internet for ours. And the first great beneficiary of that revolution was, precisely, this book. With the printing press working, a Dutch scholar named Erasmus did something bold. In the year 1516, he gathered several Greek manuscripts he had on hand and published in print the text of the New Testament in its original language, in Greek, so that any scholar in Europe could have it. That edition had defects. It was made in a hurry and with few manuscripts, and today's specialists know it well. But it lit the fuse. That printed Greek text, which over the years would come to be known as the received text, became the base from which the New Testament began to leap, at last, into the living languages of the people. And here the story turns to blood and fire, because translating the Bible into the language of the common people was, at that moment, an extremely dangerous act. The authorities feared that if any peasant could read the scriptures in his own tongue, without a priest to explain them to him, control would slip out of their hands. A German monk, in full rebellion against Rome, translated the New Testament into a vibrant, popular, beautiful German, and along the way gave shape to the modern German language as it's spoken today, But the case that most shakes me is that of a man who translated the Bible into English. He was convinced that even the boy who plowed the field had the right to read the Word of God for himself. They hunted him across all of Europe. He worked in hiding, fleeing from city to city. And in the end they caught him, tried him, strangled him, and burned his body at the stake. His crime, the only one, having put the Bible into the language of the people. The brutal thing, the thing that raises goosebumps, is that a few years after his execution, that very work for which he was burned became the basis of the English Bibles that would reach millions of hands, and that would end up crossing oceans. He died for translating a book that today is read freely in almost every language that exists on earth, because that was the final destiny of this text, and it's worth measuring it. The New Testament, which began as words spoken aloud in a poor province, which wasn't even written while its protagonist lived, became, over the centuries, the most translated text in all of human history. There's no competition. It's been rendered, whole or in parts, into thousands of languages, many of which didn't even have a written alphabet, until someone wanted to translate this book for them and had to invent one for them. From those papyri rotting in the mud, to a chain of copyists with frozen fingers, to Gutenberg's machine, to men willing to die at the stake, all the way to the device you have in your hand right now. That's the journey. And we still have to understand why, after such a voyage, this book continues to be the most read on the planet. And that question is not religious, it's historical, and it can be measured. Stop and think about how improbable everything you've just seen is. A handful of fishermen, tax collectors, and artisans in a tiny and despised province of the Roman Empire, with no printing press, no money, no power, no army, not a single university behind them. A movement whose leader was executed as a criminal, and whose first followers were persecuted, imprisoned, and several of them also executed. By all logic, those texts should have disappeared in a generation, the way thousands of writings of other sects and other teachers of the time were lost, of which today not even the name remains. But they didn't disappear. And that, for a historian, is already an enigma in itself. Because look at what this book did with the world. And this I don't ask you to believe, I ask you to look around. The date that appears on your phone today, the year you live in, is counted with a small calculation error from centuries ago, from the birth of that carpenter of Galilee. The whole planet, believers and non-believers, atheists and the devout, sign their contracts and celebrate their birthdays using a calendar that takes as point zero the central figure of this book. The first universities of Europe were born around the study of these texts. A good part of the art that fills the most visited museums in the world, paintings, sculptures, cathedrals that took centuries to build, is unintelligible if you don't know the scenes of this book. Colossal musicians composed their masterpieces on these pages, and discussions we still today take for obvious about the dignity of every person, about the care of the weak, about forgiveness, sink part of their roots, like it or not, into the ideas that traveled inside these scrolls. I'm not saying that everything done in the name of this book was good. History is also full of horrors committed by invoking it, and honesty requires saying so. I'm saying something simpler and harder to dodge, that no other ancient text left a footprint so deep and so wide on human civilization. None. And this is the mirror, the one I want to put in front of you before closing. You live in an era that has instant access to more information than any generation in history. You carry in your pocket a library that no emperor, no king, no sage of antiquity could have dreamed of. You can open the entire New Testament in your language, free, in less than 3 seconds. And precisely for that reason, almost no one stops to think about what they have in their hand. We take the logistical miracle for granted. We treat as obvious what cost rotting papyri, the frozen fingers of copyists, men burned at the stake, and 18 centuries of an unbroken chain. The generation that has had the easiest access to this text in all of history is perhaps the one that knows least about where it came from. Those first Christians crammed into a room, listening to a single copy read aloud, holding their breath, would have given their lives, and sometimes they did, for the ease with which you can ignore it today. So the question of why it's still read has, at the very least, a layer that is purely historical and that anyone can verify. It's still read because it's not a dead text that only specialists look at, like the Iliad or the speeches of Cicero, read today almost solely in classrooms. This book is still alive in the hands of ordinary people, in hundreds of languages, every day, 16 or 17 centuries after its list was closed. Few things made by human beings have had that stubbornness for not dying. And if you've come this far with me, you already know that survival was not magic. It was a chain of human decisions, of compared manuscripts, of brave translators, of anonymous copyists, of communities that recognized a voice and refused to let it go out. The history of the New Testament is deep down the history of how some words spoken aloud refused, for 2,000 years, to turn back into silence. And now let me take you back to the beginning, to the place where all of this started, a dusty province on the edge of the empire, a man who walks among the people, who eats bread, who sleeps in boats, who argues with Pharisees in broad daylight, and no one, absolutely no one, pulling out a pen, not a line written while he breathes, only voice, only air, only memory that threatens to erase itself as soon as those who heard die. If someone had been there at that precise moment, and you had told him that the words of that poor preacher, executed among criminals, were going to become the most copied, most translated, and most read text in all of human history, he would have laughed in your face. It was impossible. It was ridiculous. And yet, look at the road we traveled together. Those words spoken aloud were not erased. First memory kept them, repeated carefully from mouth to mouth. Then they leaped into ink, almost by accident, inside the urgent letters of a persecutor-turned-apostle who wrote to put out fires in distant communities and didn't know he was founding a library. Then, when the witnesses began to die and the temple burned, someone raced against time and put the accounts in writing before the last one who saw took everything to the grave. Then those texts traveled, were copied, were debated, were filtered one by one until the Christian world recognized 27 voices and left out the rest. Then they crossed from Greek into Latin and stayed 1,000 years on parchments guarded by monks with frozen fingers. Then a machine multiplied them, and men willing to be burned put them in the language of the peasant. And then, much later, they reached the device you have in your hand right now. And I want you to feel the real weight of what that means, because it's something almost no other belief of antiquity can offer. This doesn't ask you for a leap into the void. It doesn't ask you to trust a secret revelation that only an enlightened one saw and that no one can review. It puts instead a mountain of physical evidence on the table and tells you, here it is, examine it. The thousands of manuscripts exist, kept in real libraries, with names and catalogues. The oldest fragment, that little piece of papyrus with the palm of Pilate, exists. It's in a display case, in a concrete city, and anyone can go and look at it. The variants exist, and they're not hidden. They're printed in the footnotes of your own Bible, confessed in plain sight of everyone. The dates, the councils, the letters of Athanasius, the mentions of Tacitus and of Pliny writing from the Roman side, the complaints of the copyists in the margins, All of that is verifiable. It's history, not smoke, and that is perhaps the rarest and most powerful thing about this whole matter, that a text that speaks of faith should rest in its transmission on the firmest and most verifiable ground of all ancient literature. Remember that scene. The only time in all the Gospels it's told that Jesus himself wrote anything, it was with his finger, in the dirt, while a woman trembled waiting to be stoned. He didn't write in stone. He didn't write on a scroll for posterity. He wrote in dust, in the most fragile and most fleeting thing that exists, in something the first wind or the first foot was going to erase in seconds. And you already saw the irony that closes the circle. That very scene, the one of the finger in the dust, came within an inch of being lost, floated loose among the manuscripts, and only survived because anonymous copyists refused to let it die and rescued it by hand. The most fragile thing in the world, words in the dust, ended up being the most impossible to erase. Because at the end of it all, after the rotting papyri and the giant codices and the bonfires and the printing presses, the question that really remains is not only how this book survived, it's what you are going to do, now that you know where it came from, the next time you have it in front of you. Millions of people open it every day without the slightest idea of the impossible journey it traveled to reach their hands. They treat it like any object, like something that was always there. But you can't do that anymore. You already know the price. You already know that every page you turn rests on the memory of some fisherman, the courage of some translators burned alive, the ruined eyes of some nameless monks, and 18 centuries of hands that passed a torch in the dark so the flame would never go out. No one put down a single line about Jesus while he walked through Galilee. And 2,000 years later, his story is the only thing from that world that still hasn't stopped speaking. If you reach this point in the video, you're never going to be able to look at this book the same way again. If it gave you something, a like and your subscription helped this kind of history, the real and verifiable kind, reach a lot more people. And if you know someone who still believes the Bible fell from heaven already bound, send it to them. There on the screen, I've left you another video that fits perfectly with what you've just discovered, one that stands on its own. It's right there. See you in that one.